I'm going to finish up the Cold War, spending the whole time today probably on HUAC and McCarthyism, which is a huge issue even today. Remember the Red Menace, red being communism. Communism was not just paranoia after World War II because communism was spreading. From Russia, Russia had taken over all of Eastern Europe, the northern half of Korea. China was communist, and there was serious concerns about communism spreading in America. Greece almost fell to communism. Eastern half of Berlin and East Germany remained communist. So people were seriously worried about this. There were strong communist parties in many places in Europe, in Italy, in France, in Greece, and in Finland as well. And Stalin was consolidating control. He had killed millions before and during the Second World War. But the Communist Party in America was never terribly active. Although the Texas Rangers, actually in Texas in the 1940s and 50s, part of their assignment was to find communists in Texas. Actual fact, from what we know, there were never more than 100 communists in Texas, most of them involved with workers' unions. So there was an American Communist Party. There still is, as far as I know. Liberals, socialists were attracted to the Communist Party. Great idea, total equality, total democracy. But of course, communism didn't work like that, and it's directly conflicted with capitalism. Um, the American Communist Party, unlike some of the other communist parties in Europe, were out to change the American government and not destroy it. The actual numbers, because they had to register, in 1935, there were 100,000 American communists. In 1945, 80,000. I don't care about the numbers. In 1950, 43,000. By the mid 1950s, there were 5,000 American communists, which is probably about the number today. So this is not exactly a national threat, but it seemed to be looking overseas. We actually passed a law, the McCarran Internal Security Act, to register anybody that was involved with a communist organization. And this was a list that was published and made available to Congress. They were not given passports, they were not given visas. In many cases, they lost their jobs if they got on that list, accurate or not. How serious this was, Eisenhower, our president through most of the 1950s after Truman, actually asked that American communists lose their citizenship if they were American citizens. 80% of the public agreed with him. Is this constitutional? Absolutely not. In the 1950s, 20,000 people were investigated for communist sabotage. Not a single proven case, not a single person convicted, but a lot of damage done. 42% of the public in the 50s said that the press, newspapers should not criticize the US government. Again, constitutional? Not at all. All kinds of conspiracy theories. Does any of this sound familiar? This was a huge age, and it wasn't pure paranoia. There were communists in America. There just weren't very many of them. The Texas legislature passed a law making membership in the Communist Party a felony with a 20-year prison sentence. The only reason it didn't pass is Governor Shivers at the time in Texas vetoed it. Why did he veto it? He thought the penalty should be a death penalty instead of a 20-year prison sentence. So that's the only reason it wasn't passed. There are cases like Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were executed as spies in 1951, supposedly for leaking atomic secrets to the Russians. The Russians did have spies in our atomic energy agency, particularly at Los Alamos. There is no direct evidence that the Rosenbergs were ever involved, but they were executed with no hard evidence. We had a society which still exists today, the John Birch Society, created in 1948, and its whole function was anti-communism. It was named after a Baptist missionary who was killed by communists in China. Their goal was to hunt out and destroy communism in America. This is an organization that still exists, by the way. They began to accuse all kinds of people, including President Eisenhower, who was World War Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Forces. They actually accused Eisenhower of being, and I'm quoting here, a dedicated conscious agent of the Communist Party, which of course was not at all true at the time. So I am working with Red Scare, the PowerPoint Red Scare. The print is the first slide. There is a map showing the expansion of communism as the second slide. And then I am working with the two main agencies in the 1950s that were dedicated to finding communism. And in each House of Congress, they had committees hunting down communists. In the House, it was called HUAAC, HUAAC, House Un-American Activities Committee. Okay, so this is strictly in the House. The other one was the Senate McCarthy hearings. This is where the term witch hunt comes from. This was a committee of congressmen created to find un-American activities, House Un-American Activities Committees. Okay, so what they were doing were investigating possible un-American pro-sympathy communism in anything. They had the authority to investigate schools, investigate films, investigate theaters and plays, investigate government employees. They investigated the Medicare program, not Medicare, but Social Security program. They investigated particularly civil rights organizations. They set up loyalty boards in government agencies to investigate federal employees. And at many times you had to swear that you were loyal to the government and had no communist ties. Over 200 people were fired from the US government and 2,000 quit rather than swear to that oath. Who decides what's un-American? The committee. They also created a panel to investigate people. So people were called before this panel and asked about their activities, including some very important people. You had no lawyer, you had no legal defense, you could not know who was charging you or who gave the evidence against you, and you had to prove that you were loyal to the United States. And this became increasingly difficult. A senator from Washington said, if someone insists there is discrimination against Negroes in America or there is inequality of wealth, there is every reason to believe he is a commie. Why? He is criticizing the U.S. government. The Democratic 56 candidate for president, a very good man from Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, who had no communist ties, was accused of, and I'm quoting, Mr. Stevenson is guilty of spreading pro-communist propaganda by attacking with violent fury the economic system of the United States. What he had said was that some of Eisenhower's programs were questionable. You could not criticize anything without being called a communist. This is where the term witch hunt comes in. So you're called before the loyalty board. How do you get out of it? Well, we can make a deal with you. They would say, give us some other names and we'll let you off very lightly. So most people who were called before the board actually folded and gave them more names. So this is a snowball effect. How do you prove it? The same way you prove you're not a witch. It's almost impossible to prove you're a witch or not a witch. We're going back to the Middle Ages. The other thing the committee did was blacklist anyone who was at all connected with anything communist or Russia or anybody who criticized the committee. There was a famous group of people in Hollywood called the Hollywood 10, a bunch of writers and directors, and they refused to name names when they were called in front of the committee. Were there communists in Hollywood? There probably were some communists, but most people were not. This became pretty extreme. They actually canceled the release of the Disney movie Hiawatha. Why? because Hiawatha was a peacemaker in between the U.S. government and the Native American tribes, and they thought that was critical of the U.S. government. So these guys refused to name names. They went to prison. So 250 actors, thousands of writers, technicians were blacklisted. What is a blacklist? It means you're on a secret list and it's passed around in the industry and no one will hire you. This also occurs still today in industries and in government as well. It's totally illegal. It still happens. So if you're a producer in Hollywood, nobody is going to fund your movies at that point because you're on the blacklist. I have a slide there, the third slide of Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball, if you've never seen I Love Lucy movies, absolutely, you have to go see Lucy in the Chocolate Factory. It's one of the great clips in American history. Anyway, Lucille Ball, most popular program in the 1950s. Everybody in the country watched it. Remember, you only have 3 stations. Television is pretty new. And she was brought before HUAAC and asked about her communist ties. She had attended, actually, as a very young person in Hollywood, she had actually attended communist meetings for about a month. She had attended 3 or 4 meetings in 1935. This is 20 years later. And they wanted to know about her communist connections. Desi Arnaz, her husband, asked for a short time on the next program to be broadcast in America on the Lucille Ball show. And her husband got on TV and said, Lucy is not a communist. Lucy has never been a communist. There is nothing read about Lucy, including her hair, because that's not real anyway. And that was the end of the Lucille Ball story. If you look at slide number 4, it is part of the HUAAC committee, and you might recognize the young man with a lot of dark hair there. That's Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon got his start in government by serving on HUAAC. That was his first government political job. He's a new representative from Southern California, and he was put on this committee. The other person directly involved is another name you will know, the president of the Screen Actors Guild, in other words, the Actors Union in Hollywood. He had ties with HUAAC. He was feeding them information. He was so important that the FBI even had a secret code name for him. That man, the head of the Actors Union, who should have been protecting his actors and instead was informing on them, true or false, Ronald Reagan, who was a big movie star in the 1950s. If you've ever read Arthur Miller's The Crucible, it is written in the 1950s. It was written about HUAAC. He could not directly use that, so he wrote about the Salem witch trials. What he was really talking about was HUAAC, because it was the same thing. You are convicted with no evidence or slurred with no evidence. A lot of people lost their jobs, either by innuendo or suspicion. People committed suicide because of this. This was no joke. A lot of people's lives were destroyed, thousands in U.S. government. The other part of that, and the last slide, you will see Joseph McCarthy. McCarthyism is a term we still hear today. Joe McCarthy was the junior senator from Wisconsin. He was an alcoholic. He was a man whore, my favorite term for that. He took bribes, he misused campaign funds, and most importantly, he was an absolute pathical liar. He lied about his age, he lied in his first job, he lied particularly in World War II. He said he was a tail gunner in an airplane, in a combat plane. Tail gunner is one of the most dangerous jobs. They had a clear glass bubble with a machine gun, and they were shooting down enemy planes before they shot the plane they were riding in. The death rate of tail gunners was astronomically high. He lied about that. He never fought in combat. He was never even issued a weapon. He had a desk job. He never flew. He never got near a plane. But he lied systematically. So the issue with liars, pathological liars, is after a while they forget what's true and what's a lie. He's elected to Congress, and he was being investigated by a Senate, this is in the Senate committee, for tax evasion scandals, where he was avoiding paying federal taxes. So to kind of deflect attention, does any of this sound familiar? He began talking about communists. Communists were infiltrating the CIA, and they were infiltrating bomb construction plants in America. Of course, U.S. senators were very interested in this. They start talking about it, and McCarthy stands up in Congress one day, holds up a piece of paper in his hand, and says, on this piece of paper, I have the names of 250 communist agents in the U.S. government. Of course, the Senate went wild. They asked him to name names. He threw out a few names. The first name had never worked in the State Department. Guy never worked there. The second name had retired years ago and had nothing to do with communism. He stopped naming names. What did he have on that actual piece of paper? It was a blank sheet of paper. He was just throwing out a few names he remembered. Again, the man is a pathological liar. Some senators who knew him knew this quite well. One of them said McCarthy couldn't find a communist in Red Square if he was there. The guy in back of him, on slide number 5, is a man named Roy Cohn, who was his right-hand man and his main aide. He was Jewish, who cares? He was also gay. He was a homosexual, which in the 1950s is a pretty dangerous thing to be. Nobody was out of the closet. He had a boyfriend who was in the U.S. Army, had just been drafted, and his boyfriend was going to be posted overseas. And what Cohn and McCarthy were trying to do, we found out much later, is have the boyfriend stationed someplace near Washington, D.C., so Roy Cohn would have access to his boyfriend. Roy Cohn, I have to say, also a pathological liar. Interesting case. He became a lawyer for the mob in New York City, and later became a lawyer for, big surprise, Donald Trump as well. So, Roy Cohn, McCarthy begin to escalate. The more people say, where are the names? What's going on here? The more he's making up charges. Again, this is a witch hunt. There is absolutely no evidence. He accused George Marshall of having communist ties. Truman's Secretary of State, who came up with the Marshall Plan, probably because they were extending aid to Russia. He accused at one point President Eisenhower, who was commander of the Allied forces in World War II and president at the time. He said that Eisenhower, I'm quoting again, invariably serves the Kremlin. He also said that the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, had a letter with proof of all of these things. Congress immediately went to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and said, where's the evidence? What do you have? Where's these letters? Hoover said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't have any letter with anything to do with this, which was actually true. So, as the accusations escalate, the Army, they begin to accuse Army generals, including Eisenhower, of communist ties, and the Army got sick of it. In 1954, they hired a lawyer, and they took McCarthy to court. Okay? If you have this evidence, we want to see it. And if you really have an extra half an hour, I would show clips of this in class. The Army McCarthy hearings on YouTube are well worth seeing, particularly the last 15 minutes of it. So McCarthy is on one side, and his aide, Roy Cohn, is in back of him. The Army lawyers and the military brass is on the other side. 36 days of hearings. It is televised nationwide. McCarthy on live television turns to slush. He is an alcoholic. He has all kinds of mental problems, and you can see him in those Army McCarthy hearings. He literally disintegrates. He starts babbling. He's not making any sense. People are trying to figure out what he says. And when asked about it in the hallway later, he said, I don't understand. What did I do? Well, what you did was accuse the U.S. Army of communist ties. The whole time, Eisenhower says nothing. Why? I'm not getting into the gutter with that guy. He stayed above the whole thing. He could have probably shut it down and certainly have criticized McCarthy, and he says nothing and allows it to go on until finally the Army gets into it. The Army shut it down. it became clear to the public that this guy was not playing with a full deck, that there was no evidence at all. What he did in the hearings, if you watch them, is he turned around and he accused the lawyers, accusing him of communist ties, of which there was absolutely no evidence. But still had a lot of public support. About half of the public supported McCarthy until he was finally removed. The army helped bring him down. It was finally a newsman on an evening newscast, the major figure of his time, Edward R. Murrow, who had a half-an-hour newscast systematically explaining why McCarthy had no evidence, and this was all just a witch hunt with no proof. The effects of this were long-lasting, and in fact, sometimes still last today. What happens, anybody who wants to criticize, anybody who wants to debate U.S. government policy learns to shut up. Does any of this sound familiar? It created paranoia, not only in the U.S. government, but in the public at large, because with HUAAC, any citizen could be accused of communist sympathies or communist ties. They could pick you up and take you in front of HUAC. You had no lawyer, you had no defense, you couldn't know who was charging you, and you had to defend yourself alone. So lots of people lost jobs. A good number committed suicide. At the end of all this, by 1960, not a single conviction for communist conspiracy or communist espionage. Not one. So all of this is unnecessary. So when you hear today the term McCarthyism, what it means is a witch hunt. It means slander with absolutely no evidence. And its effects are still with us today. People still hesitate to speak out because they will be accused of something, and whether you're guilty or not, the accusation is around your neck and it stays with you. Okay, so we're moving on into the 1950s next time. Stay safe, stay busy. Bye.